Okay, I'm letting people in, and Rakip, maybe in 2 minutes you can start.
2 minutes. Okay, all right. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone present here, wherever you may be in the world. We have 4 interesting presentations today. We have our first speaker in the person of Dr. Abubakari Ahmed from the University of Development Studies, now the University for Business and Integrated Development Studies. He's going to present on heterogeneous infrastructure and informality, filling the gap or a governance failure. The second presenter is going to be in the person of Dr. Mtafu Manda from Mzuzu University. He's going to present on formalizing the informal through the formal. Kabaza taxis and other informals is in Mzuzu, Malawi. The third is going to be Dr. Rusca from Uppsala University. He's going to present on Lilongwe waterworks, the production of inequalities within the centralized water supply system. The final presenter is going to be Dr. Busisiwe Chikomborero. Please pardon me if I've gotten your name wrong. Makore from the University of Salford. She's going to present on age-friendly infrastructure in Africa's cities, enabling health and well-being for older people in urban Zimbabwe. So 4 interesting presentations. What we have agreed to do is to have questions coming in after each presentation. Then at the end of the 4 presentations, we can still have question sessions, and then we have our discussant, Professor Alexandra Gasparatos. So I think we'll just go straight to our first presenter, Dr. Abubakari Ahmed. If he's around, he can take over from here. Thank you.
Sorry, I was trying to mute my screen, my distance from the so I could talk. I hope everybody can hear me now. Yeah, okay. Thank you, Dr. Salia, for the beautiful and wonderful introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here to share with you or some thoughts about one of my recent research that I'm doing. And it is about heterogeneous infrastructure in everyday African cities. So basically, the idea has been that heterogeneous infrastructure has come out a bit more saliently as a hybrid way through which state, the government, private sector, and individual self-help can come together in the co-provisioning of different sort of infrastructures, be it infrastructure on urban waste management or infrastructure on transport, infrastructure on health, energy, or water. So the idea has been that the concept of heterogeneous infrastructure configuration has come as a way to show us another analytical way through which we can look at how people use social practices in trying to meet their daily urban infrastructure needs. So basically, today I'm coming to share with you this idea by drawing insights from the case of electricity infrastructure provision in the case of Ghana, to try to illustrate how different social practices are used by people in informal settlements to co-provide their electricity needs. So basically, to start with, in the context of sub-Saharan African countries, one of the clear things that we've noticed is that recent studies have branded sub-Saharan Africa as the epicenter for global energy poverty. And then the idea is that households become energy poor if they cannot realize their capabilities resulting from insufficient access to affordable, clean, or reliable energies, or if they are unable, not only as a matter of ability to purchase or to pay, but they are excluded socially or materially, or they are deprived as a result of injustices that are emanating in how people are sourcing energy, distributing it, or pricing energy. So in sub-Saharan African countries, over 600 million people currently do not have electricity. And in the case of Ghana, statistics are showing that over 5 million people do not have electricity in Ghana. So what are some of the existing studies saying? There's a lot of studies have argued that in order to meet this gap, it is imperative for state to expand its infrastructure services through the network electricity grids so that every household can have access to the national grid. And that has been the dominant kind of idea that have been promoted. And this has attracted a lot of funding in large-scale urban infrastructure and rural electricity projects in sub-Saharan Africa, including Ghana. But however, in recent times, the idea has been that the state do not only, aside having the capacity to plan and regulate, there are also other lived realities and social practices in African cities that are imperative and also helping in trying to address this particular energy gap. And so these situated practices are important because they also provide other sources or other avenues through which people access infrastructure. So the idea that the social and technical heterogeneity has gained a lot of attention now in the literature, in that it's not only the government network services that can provide infrastructure to everyday people in urban areas or across different jurisdictions, but rather there are also some sort of social practices that are also important in providing this. And these ideas needs to be understood and how or what are the issues shaping them. And by understanding them, the issues can lead into some sort of policies that are well situated and very specific to specific areas. So the idea of heterogeneous infrastructure, like I've said, has gained attention, but a lot of people have not really questioned one aspect of it, that inequalities, as we know, has been one of the major issues of infrastructure. The fact that heterogeneous infrastructure has emerged as a way through which we can understand different social practices. Does it mean that heterogeneous infrastructure or the heterogeneity in itself is another way of looking at inequalities? Given that if we say heterogeneous, that, okay, I have access to water by a through tap, somebody has access to water by through a well, other person has water by through a standpipe. We are heterogeneous in a way that, and we are configured differently. And this configuration reflects different sort of inequalities, that my ability to get water is because I can pay for standpipe. Another person's ability is because he or she can pay from the standpipe or connect pipe to the dwelling. And this reflects different levels of inequalities. And so these different levels of inequalities are social practices that a lot of the urban poor are engaged in. And in these practices, the question I posed is that, are they actually filling the gap that the state-led infrastructure has created? or are they a manifestation of a governance failure emanating from the actions and inactions of state and state actors? So in trying to address this question, I draw insights from the case of electricity access in Ghana. And in Ghana, statistics are showing that over 64% of people are not connected to the national grid. And currently, if you look at the installed capacity of electricity, it is a bit high, but what is actually being produced is very low. And there's often a large kind of gap between supply and demand of electricity in Ghana. And annually, electricity demand increases by 10%. And in urban areas, it is actually very difficult for state to provide or for states to meet this electricity needs. And what is accounting for the reason why a lot of people are not having access to electricity? From state data set, the ideas are very, very, very diverse. If you look at the urban areas, the most important reason why people are not connecting to electricity is because of the initial cost of connection, which is very expensive. And then also the monthly bills are also a bit expensive. Aside these, the bureaucracy that you go through to get electricity, especially when you are living in an informal settlement like the one I'm going to show, is very cumbersome because you are living in an area that is classified as informal, whereby you do not have tenure title, but yet you want to get access to national grid, which requires that you must show a document or a proof of tenancy, or you must show a site plan, or you must show some sort of legal ownership to the land, of which you do not have. So now how do people in such areas cope that if they cannot have access to state-led electricity infrastructure, how do they cope? By using other alternative means. So to look at that, first, I want to draw attention to probably one of these phrases a lot of people might have heard or somewhere, or I want to show, is the idea of dumso. In Ghana, it is basically a local term that is used to describe the erratic and unplanned power outages. And then because even though there is electricity access for some of the urban poor, except those that do not have, those that have also complained bitterly about this dumso phenomenon, that electricity comes, it goes on and off, and it's basically as a result of multiple reasons. You see a lot of people having long queues waiting for electricity to buy, and then also you have this old and aged infrastructure, the transformers that drips off us, and when the load is too much, and then electricity cables that are very old and are not replaced, and all these factors put together let the electricity supply very, very erratic. And as a result, people are not having confidence in the state grid because of this experience of unplanned power outages. And as a result, different individuals have started to look at alternatives through which they can have more reliable, secured, and cheap or affordable energy for themselves. So to do this, the state is responding through different ways, and then the urban poor are also coping through different alternative ways. And I want to show this by drawing insights from one neighborhood in Accra. It is called Nima. Nima is an informal settlement, and it's the largest informal settlement that is inhabited by the people from the northern part of the country. And it is basically a Muslim predominant community that has one of the largest markets in Accra, very popular. And often you see some research or some studies have branded it as a settlement of traders. In Nima, majority of the people there are basically doing trading for their basic sustenance. And then it is highly, very, very densely populated. As you can see in these pictures, a lot of settlements crowded together. And then there is no much space. And with this kind of settlements, what you can imagine is how, if somebody is living here that do not have access to tenure, how can such a person have access to national grid that requires some sort of legal documentation to show proof of tenancy and other arrangements before they can connect you to the national grid? And so this is the reality. But then the question is, in the absence of this state infrastructure and the erratic way in which it is, how are people coping? To do this, I did some household surveys in Nima, also by collaborating with one of the NGOs called People's Dialogue on Human Settlement. Then I also talked to some sellers of electrical appliances that are in that particular neighborhood, and also some government officials such as the Energy Commission, the Ministry of Energy, among others. And to show you some kind of results, or the first one is just basically, I wanted to compare Nima to other neighborhoods that are in Accra to see how energy poor are they in terms of their energy access to services and others. And as you can see in this graph, Nima, if you compare to other five neighborhoods, you can see that Nima as a neighborhood is energy compared to some other per-urban neighborhoods. Nima as a neighborhood in this inner city is a bit having an energy poverty index that is a bit higher. That is, if you compare by the average of Ghana Energy Poverty Index and that of the National Energy Poverty Index, you can see that they all fall below that of the average for Nima. And this shows that the people in Nima compared to the urban areas in Ghana, Nima is a bit, most of the people there, or like from the data that I have shown that Nima can be classified as part of the energy poor people compared to the average in urban areas in Ghana. Now, understanding that they are energy poor, how or what kind of alternatives are they using to cope with their energy needs? The first is the state-led. So and that is through the rooftop solar PV program, of which the government is saying it wants to provide over 2,000 PVs to residential houses. But the issue with this is that you must be attached to a commercial bank in Ghana, of which you have to pay it as a loan. And then you must turn all your bulbs in your house to LED bulbs. And then you must use licensed installers from the Energy Commission. And then you must also show proof of residential permits and all those legal documents before you can access that. And then the government gives subsidy, but the subsidy is just around $300 compared to the cost of around $800 to $1,200. And so a lot of people in Nima complain that they cannot have access to this state-led alternative for them in terms of when power is erratic, or those that do not have access to electricity. So because they cannot have access to this alternative, what are they doing? A number of them have decided to collaborate with non-state actors. So the non-state actor, for example, the Slum Dwellers International, through the help of the People's Dialogue on Human Settlement, provide solar PVs for homes at a very reduced price. And here, it is interesting that when you talk to the residents, they tell you that, okay, a number of families can come together and try to purchase one PV, put it on top of the roof, and then connect the lights to their bulbs in their individual houses. So this is a type of social practices where they rely on their social bonding and support to co-purchase an appliance that will help them have electricity when power is erratic or when there's no electricity available. Also, what you also see aside the non-state actor is the self-help. Now, a lot of people buy what we call the solar lanterns and then the torchlights. And whenever there is doomsday or the unplanned power outages, then they quickly turn them on and they are able to still have electricity. And those that also do not have electricity at all rely on these kind of rechargeable solar lamps and they use them. And one thing you can notice that when I did interviews with the sellers of electrical appliances, that these kind of dynamics are actually helping their businesses, and then they are emerging as new energy entrepreneurs, and they are willing to sell and sell more of such appliances because of the increasing demand, and that many people are interested in some of these services. Then again, another example of alternative self-help is the use of small generators. So, and interesting to note that is that one person can decide to buy the generator while the other neighbors will always contribute and then buy fuel whenever there is a power outage. So they come together, one person can own the generator, but can decide to connect the bulbs to the other people's houses. And those people will help in a purchasing of fuel that is to be used by the generator. And this is also another way of social practice that people are using to cope with power outages and electricity supply. Still, another kind of social practice that is also very common and that most Ghanaians can relate to is the sharing of meter. And because it is very cumbersome and bureaucratic to get electricity from the national grid, those that already have are often at the mercy, or they often want to help those that cannot have. So what they do is that I can go for a meter because of my social ties and connection and networks. And once I get the meter, I can decide to share it with maybe Dr. Salia, Dr. Gasparatos, so that we all connect to the same meter and then use that as our source of electricity or access to the national grid. But what happened is that the cumulative consumption of all those that are hooked onto one meter end up getting higher than the average threshold that will warrant that urban poor person to have enjoyed the government subsidy. So the cumulative expense or consumption of the three people that are sharing the meter gets higher. And as a result, the poor people will pay more for the electricity because the cumulative consumption is high. As compared to if it was one person per meter, the consumption would have been lesser and the person would have enjoyed the state subsidy of being or consumption or having a consumption that is below the lifeline. And what happened is that when these practices, and like another from interview is that it's often characterized by a lot of fighting, and especially because of unjust or unfair distribution of the cost. So at the end of the month, when it's time for them to either share the bills or to contribute and go and buy the light, the one who owns the meter might either be willing or unwilling to collaborate or to cooperate. And this often leads to a lot of social conflicts in that particular neighborhood. And when people are experiencing some of this conflict, they resort to other options, and that is the illegal connections. When they cannot pay bills, they just decide to maybe tap illegally by using some wires and doing their own sort of activities to connect to the national grid and use electricity for free. And this often increase or often lead to a lot of electricity theft in Ghana. And that is often a common practice government have been trying to, but then it is also a social practice a lot of the urban poor dwellers are using. And another one that is example of social practice that is also being used is that if you drive through neighbor or walk around, you will see the small vendors that are seated with a lot of mobile phone chargers in front of them. And basically they are doing this charging at a fee. So those people who do not have or have erratic electricity supply or do not have access to electricity, but they want to either charge their mobile phones or have charge other rechargeable appliances, they basically bring them to these vendors. Then these vendors will charge at a fee. And mostly these vendors can either use electricity from national grid, or they also sometimes use generators, the small diesel power generators that I showed earlier. So this is just to show you that different social practices are being used by a lot of urban dwellers as a way of coping. And this kind of social practices reflect the heterogeneous nature through which electricity infrastructure is co-produced, either through self-help or through partnership from non-state actors. So the heterogeneous infrastructure configuration, as I've shown, is that you can see a hybridity in the energy service delivery. That is the non-state actors, the state actors, and the informal self-help activities. All this put together in trying to meet the electricity needs of the urban people. And that is not only a matter of state-led infrastructure, but a co-provision incrementally through this sort of social activities. And what or the core argument that I want to show, or I earlier on post, is that I make the argument that this co-provisioning through incremental practices to some extent are very helpful in addressing the energy needs gap, in the sense that those that could not have access to electricity or are experiencing erratic power supply use different social practices to cope with this. But on the other side of it, other studies argue that some of these self-help activities are also a manifestation of governance failure, in the sense that the state-led infrastructure has not, or has long just only focused narrowly on only formal grid system without giving due attention to other off-grid alternatives that could have been important in addressing the energy needs. But one important thing that we need to note is that although these heterogeneous infrastructures or these social practices are helping, they also sometimes have some negative place-based externalities. For example, the illegal connections, a lot of them use substandard electricity cables. And those from Ghana can relate with me that in many cases of urban fires in Accra now, the most important reason mostly they say is the use of substandard electrical cables. And it's often because of these illegal connections that people are just trying to cope with electricity infrastructure, to cope with the service delivery, because the state is unable, and then they end up using illicit activities and substandard ones that leads to some sort of these urban fires. So just to summarize, is one point that we need to note from the state is that throughout the interviews, a lot of people said that the alternative that the state is providing through this rooftop solar is not actually helpful to the urban poor because of the bureaucracies and complexities in accessing it. And also interviews with the Energy Commission shows that governments sometimes have this inconsistent import duties for PVs. Sometimes it goes higher, sometimes it comes down. And then there's no clear legal framework or policy for household solar PVs. So as a result, the market is very fragmented and not coordinated. And these are kind of the issues that are actually not helping. So just to conclude, or what I want to bring to your attention is that there is a need to shift a little bit from the decentralized approach of saying that the state must provide electricity or every aspect of, to incorporate some of these other different modalities, that is social practices. And to do these social practices, state partnership with non-state actors can provide synergies that can help in the deliveries of some of these energy needs. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed Abubakari, for the clear, beautiful, and concise presentation. Attendees can use the raise hand button for any questions they wish to share with colleagues. We also have a few questions in the chat box that I would like to read out. The first one is from Beacon Mbiba. Dr. Ahmed, how is the energy poverty index compiled and interpreted?
Okay, yeah, to respond briefly, the energy poverty index was formulated by a group at University of Oxford, and it's an index that brings together about 8 indicators. So it's basically asking the household whether, for example, do you have electricity connected to your house? Yes or no. And this can either be like with the yes or no, if the household has, then the household is not deprived. If the household doesn't have it, then the household is deprived. But the indicator cuts across energy access, energy for cooking, and the energy for lighting, and also access or ownership to some energy-related appliance, such as a fridge, mobile phone, and radio. Basically to understand whether the household really have access to good or affordable electricity and energy for cooking and lighting. And basically the interpretation is that once you put those numbers, or basically whether the household is deprived or not, out of those 8 indicators, you put them together through a simple arithmetic. The idea is that it should be between 0 to 1. And then when it is below or it was close to 0, the better. When it is higher to 1, it means that the household is more poor. And maybe this is just the little a simple lesson that I can give, since other people might have questions too.
The next one is from Wanika from Kampala, Uganda. He's asking, do you feel once African cities standardize city planning and urban form, which by law, that is traffic congestion, demand for housing, there will also emerge the need to standardize infrastructure system and networks, even if emerging micro off-grid infrastructure might appear to be solving the problem, even though there are new pollution problems with toxic battery materials, etc.
Okay, yeah, that is a very interesting question. The idea is that the standardizing of infrastructure system in Africa, to me, I won't ascribe to that ideology, because Africa context, even when it comes to city planning, is very, very diverse, in the sense that, especially we know that majority of urban African issues, a bit of informality is very, very prevalent, and it has stayed as a feature or a character of most African cities. So by standardizing that what can work in Ghana might work in Kampala might not be the case, because there are diverse context-specific social practices, political drivers, and other enabling and barriers that might prevent or hinder or impede what is applicable in Ghana to be applicable, for example, in Kampala. So maybe a move towards more situated practices or infrastructure systems could be more ideal in the context of growing African cities, in my opinion.
The next one is from Beacon Mbiba once more, regarding the alternative methods of energy provision. To what extent do these provide energy for all uses? In particular, do they provide energy for cooking?
Yeah, yes. For this presentation, I only decided to focus on energy for lighting, but also energy for cooking is also another thing that we have another heterogeneous configuration when it comes to energy for cooking. Some people decide to use charcoal, others decide to use LPG, others decide to use firewood, others decide to do a combination of 2 or more, depending on whether they can afford or they can not get access to a particular source. So that is also similar for energy for cooking. But just that for this presentation, I only decided to focus on electricity access, but it's also similar notion for alternative for energy for cooking as well.
Okay, the next one is from Dr. Maria Rusca. She's saying that I am very sympathetic with the argument of the risks of normalizing inequalities by accepting or embracing heterogeneous infrastructures. In my area of work, that is WASH, it is clear that meeting the SDGs is grounded on the fundamental acceptance that global people will have access to starkly different types of water and sanitation services. I just wonder if the problem is heterogeneity per se, or the type of heterogeneity, both in terms of technologies and technical arrangements that we are developing. As you point out, centralized networks are not a panacea.
Yes, I agree to some extent. Like, as I was speaking, I made the point that heterogeneity is actually unequal, and that it is in a way actually perpetuating the inequality that manifests. And I gave an example that if I have access, and I used water, for example, if I have access to water from pipe, another person have access through the borehole, and another person through the well, these are heterogeneous configurations. But the one from the well is having access to poor quality water, whereas the one from the the pipe connected to the dwelling might have access to clean water. So if you are saying that you want to understand heterogeneous configuration, are you actually perpetuating these inequalities, or you are trying to understand them? But the idea of heterogeneous configuration is not to perpetuate these inequalities, but to understand them and know what is driving them. And by understanding them and know what is driving them, then you can know the context-specific solution you can ascribe or prescribe to this. I think that is the idea. It's not that it is perpetuating inequalities, but to understand what is even driving that inequalities and what kind of solution that you can propose.
The next one is from Dr. Chiku. She's asking, I am wondering if there's a particular group or category of residents that lead the co-production and self-help practices, or is it based on households and groups of households?
Yeah, okay, yeah, this is true. Probably I should have categorized my the respondents in a certain way. But what happens is that I talk to household, and then basically each household will tell you, for example, that, okay, I am co-sharing a meter with somebody. So and basically the unit of analysis that I was using was just household. But talking to the home electrical cell appliances were just individual categories as persons. So what you see is that the co-production of the self-help practices are at the household levels and then the individual levels.
Okay, thank you very much. In the interest of time, noting that some of our friends in Japan may be somewhere around 11 or 12 midnight, we want to go to the next presentation. You can also feel free to leave your comment or question on the comment section or chat section. Our next presenter is Dr. Mtafu Manda from the Mzuzu University. He's going to present on formalizing the informal through the formal Kabaza taxis and other informals in Mzuzu, Malawi. Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed, once again. So if Dr. Mtafu is around, you can take over from here. Thank you.
Someone put up the presentation because I couldn't share easily from here. Thank you very much for making this possible, that we can share what is going on in Malawi here. This is not a recent research. It was done about 3 or 4 years ago, but the observations from that time continued to obtain on the ground. So when a request was made for this presentation, I thought I should go back to this issue to highlight the situation that is faced by the informal sector in this country. Can we move then? So just for those who are not from around this part of the world, Malawi is surrounded by Tanzania to the north, Zambia to the west, and almost engulfed by Mozambique in a palm. The population is around 18 million, and only 20% of that is in the urban areas. The majority of this population is just in 4 cities of Mzuzu, Lilongwe, and Blantyre. Mzuzu is the smallest one. I think the 3rd largest is actually the fastest growing at 5.4%. Within Mzuzu, some 70% of the population are actually unemployed, are informally employed. And that employment includes our colleagues who are riding bicycles and motorcycle taxis, which are called Kabaza here, but also the urban farming, coffee workshops, car washing, and fabricators. Since informality is broadly seen as illegal in this country, one would look at these people as also illegally employed. So this presentation is trying to highlight this apparent contradiction by drawing on the Global South planning debates, in particular, the issue of the conflicting rationalities. Can we proceed? Why did we have the Kabaza and other informals emerge here? This has been the trend since about 1990s, and estimates about 2014 were that we had about 4,000 operators of Kabaza, and that number may have doubled in recent years, perhaps until this year. So the main causes of this are the high unemployment, which is due to the weak economy of this country, but also the frequent closures of major industries. Just recently, we had the Coca-Cola plant was closed, and this was a major employer of around 4,000 people. So as Jim has noted, this business of Kabaza is a sort of refuge for those who are failing to get into the formal sector. We also have in Mzuzu a very poor road network. Only less than 60% of the roads are paved, and the rest are mere footpaths and the earth tracks. And because of that, the operators of Kabaza look at that as a business venture by the former employees, who incidentally, can we proceed? Mainly the owners of these bicycle taxis. So if you look at the benefits of Kabaza, you will see that they are relied upon by many poor people in Mzuzu to travel to work, to travel to their businesses, and for students to go to school. They are also relied upon by virtually everyone in the city because they are a form of town to home courier service. You buy your properties, and based on the trust that you have realized with the operators, you send them to deliver at your home while you concentrate on your work at the office. Then they also transport the passengers and the goods straight to the doorstep, which improves the safety of the passengers themselves. Some of them could be women, others very small children who have just come from school. So dropping them along the main roads becomes risky in terms of accidents or rogues. So in that context, you can see that the Kabaza operators are a major source of income which people can use to pay for their rent, to buy food, to build houses, and even to access health services. Can you proceed? But the main challenges that are experienced are resulting mainly from the congestion on the roads. Nearly all the roads in this city are meant for a car. So the pedestrians are not provided for, and the bicycles are not provided for. So there's now a conflict over the use of this same road, in the process leading to several accidents. You will see down there, I am mentioning about the total number of accidents that have occurred countrywide, but also in Mzuzu. The Kabaza operators and owners actually are facing problems because they do not pay taxes, have no driver's licenses, or they don't insure their vehicles. And those vehicles also have no certification. A major problem that is also observed is overloading. Ideally, a motorbike or a bicycle is supposed to have the driver himself and the customer, but these guys are able to carry sometimes up to 4 passengers because they want to increase the income that they realize from the business. One can also observe that there is unfair trading practices from state employees who in most cases are the owners of these bicycles and motorcycles. So under the guise of implementing the laws, the police officers will arrest the operators to reduce the competition. This information is usually coming from the operators themselves. They even give names of the senior officers in government, senior officers in the army, as well as in the police. They say, so have bicycles. How come theirs are not being confiscated by the police? Let's proceed. Can we proceed? Yes. So here you see the contradictions that while the transport policy that was just approved in 2019 recognizes the role of Kabaza as a healthy, sustainable, economic, and non-polluting, and therefore proposes that they should be planned for in the cities, they are actually being less provided for. The operators are being harassed in various forms. You see also there that the government itself removed the custom duties on imported motorbikes with engines of 100 cc. The idea being to promote this business. Likewise, recently as I'm speaking, there are even proposals now to provide loans for the procurement of the motorbikes. But as it were, you will see that most of the government workers, the senior ones, of course, tend to be the owners, while the ones we see on the roads are mere employees, or they rent those bicycles. So in view of the SDGs targets on access to safe, affordable, sustainable transport systems and the road safety for the vulnerable, we cannot realize these targets because there is no mechanism for doing so. You will see in that picture, it shows the number of motorbikes that have been confiscated by the police, alleged for not having licenses or for failing to obtain their own driver's licenses. Can we proceed? The other informals, I've just outlined two of them. There's the issue of urban farming, which is a dominant source of food, income, and jobs in the city, but it remains unregulated. Even though the city of Mzuzu has turned a blind eye to food production, they are heavy-handed on food sellers. So that is another contradiction. They allow food production to take place in the city, but they don't recognize those who are selling the food, the fresh foods in the city. In the process, the traders have to hide or run away from the police, leading to a lot of loss of the food as well as their potential incomes. Now, what is interesting there is that where the officials themselves are not direct actors, the law is implemented with force. Where they are themselves some of benefit, they try to turn a blind eye. Next slide. The other informal that I put up here is the growth of the coffin workshops and the sales, which is now a booming industry along most of the roads that are leading to the Mzuzu Central Hospital. The number of entrepreneurs and the stock of the coffins has actually apparently increased because of COVID pandemic. However, these do not meet the wrath of the city officials or the National Roads Authority as much as you would have expected the things that happened to the other informals. So presumably here, one would argue that they are leaving this untouched because they also need this service sometime in the future. The next, if not the last slide. So what can we do then if we want to formalize these informals? Because what is informal legally is actually practically formal. So I show you a photograph there of a police officer riding one of the bicycle taxis to work. But when duty calls on him, he will confiscate the same bicycle that took him to work. So what can we do about this? In my view, I think we need some mindset change to understand the contextuality of our cities. We need policy reviews to reflect the reality of informality as a mode of urbanization. The transport policy itself has already set the pace in recognizing Kabaza. What we need now is just to make the needful by implementing the proposals. We also need to retrain planners so that they are able to think about global south rather than, as the case obtains, global north urbanization. It's very common here. Everyone is comparing cities in Malawi to the cities that are not in Malawi, to the cities that they have not even visited, just because they see them on TV and they think, oh, our city would reach that stage. And then finally there, I think there is need to incorporate the informals in the city plans. There I am very specific. I'm not talking about city planning, but in the city plan itself, so that we can have cycleways, we can have paved pickup points for these operators. In that way, through this formal means, then we could be formalizing these informals so that they are able to benefit the population, but also to benefit for their own livelihood in the city. So if we can use these formal processes, we can therefore realize the broad planning objectives, but also contribute to urban governance. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mandanda, for the intriguing and wonderful presentation. We have a few questions in our chat box here.
Please.
We have the first one from Dr. Ransford Achampon. He wants to know which modes dominates Kabaza fleet, motorcycles or bicycles? And in the case of bicycles, do they share routes with motorized modes? How is the infrastructure support like?
Actually, the bicycles are dominant, but recently the same bicycles, after earning adequate income, they are upgrading themselves by acquiring motorbikes. All of them, they are sharing the same roads, the bicycles, the motorbikes, the vehicles, and pedestrians.
Okay. Thank you very much. The next one is from Daniel Buanika. He wants to know what form of social security do the Kabazas have? That is in terms of road safety, medical insurances, and old age pension. While the Kabazas can sustain themselves with a hand-to-mouth daily income, what are your views about Africa's transport infrastructure, innovation, and technology developments with a transport informality in sustaining local government incomes and offering public services to given population clusters, children, elderly, disabled, women?
Unless the road infrastructure is improved to the extent that each home is able to access their homes by road, I am afraid to say that cities like Mzuzu have to rely on Kabaza for much long time than we can predict. The solution to this is to provide for them in the form of providing cycleways, providing parking slots, but also recognizing them and regulating them within the existing laws so that they are able to operate formally, because practically, as I said, they are recognized. Practically, they are recognized because the same state officials, the same security officials are actually partaking in this meal of Kabaza. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you have any other contribution or further comments, you can leave them in our chat box. We go to the next presentation in the person of Dr. Maria Rusca from Uppsala University. She's going to present on Lilongwe waterworks, the production of inequality within the centralized water supply network.
Thank you very much, and it was great to hear Mtafu's presentations, a lot of memories about Mzuzu. I'm also presenting about Malawi, but not Mzuzu, another city that Mtafu has briefly mentioned, and that is, sorry, this is the wrong, this is, stop, this is current presentation, there you go. which is Lilongwe. I'm sorry, I got confused with the PowerPoint. It should be the right one. Okay. And sorry again, this is not moving. All right, I managed. So again, thank you very much to the organizers of this excellent series of seminars, which I have enjoyed very much, and I'm very happy to contribute to today. As I was saying, I'm also presenting about Malawi, but looking at the capital, Lilongwe. And I'm looking in particular at the production of inequalities within the centralized water supply network. I thought that I wanted to discuss this from the perspective really of looking at water infrastructures and in particular looking at agency of water infrastructure in producing water inequalities. And there are 3 points, related points that I would like to look at. I will look at, the first one is perhaps a little bit known, and I will talk about this more as a way of introducing the case study, which is how do social worlds shape infrastructural configurations, but still emphasizing particularly how looking at infrastructure and understanding infrastructure helps us also to reveal some of the power relations underlying the development of a city, and in this case, the city of Lilongwe. And the second point is actually looking at how infrastructures and water's property, so also the quality of water, shape material and social worlds. And in looking at these 2 points, I will particularly try to focus implicitly and explicitly on a reflection on the role of infrastructure, a lens on infrastructure. What does it add to our understanding of processes of societal inclusion and exclusions? How do they help us to understand social difference, and to what extent a focus on infrastructure can help us achieve or promote more social just cities? And to do that, I will focus on 5 related points, of course, related to infrastructures, the force of infrastructures. And I'm thinking here of 5 elements. One is the force of distributing matter. And so drawing on Larkin, the idea that infrastructures are objects which enable or disable the movement of matter, and in our case, water. And then I will focus particularly on the force of shaping social order, thinking really that, as discussed by Latour, that infrastructure really literally and not metaphorically change and construct social order. A third point is that infrastructure also transform matter, in that they are able to protect or not protect the water that they distribute. And so what is the role of one matter infrastructure in transforming another matter, which is water? Infrastructure also produces a certain discursive constructions of good and bad water quality that have strong implications on the way individual citizens are responsibilized in terms of waterborne diseases. And I will say about this more about towards the end of the presentation. And the last point is the force of unintended consequences. So the idea that we build infrastructure with the idea that they will provide a certain function, but as we build them and they become part of our urban environment, in this particular case, they also produce relations that exceed human control and that exceed the expectations or the unintended consequences of that infrastructure. So I will start with this first point on the force of distributing water, and looking at it from the perspective of how they produce flows and inequalities. Of course, the first element, relevant element, is of course the presence and absence of infrastructure. And as we note in several cities in the Global South, and as we've seen also in other presentations, this infrastructure, this centralized water supply network in Lilongwe does not cover the entire urban area. So we have only one part of the city where we look at the centralized network. And that is the first, of course, evident form of differentiation across the city of Lilongwe. while there is a tendency to think of inequalities as those who have access to public services and those who have not access to public services, here we will focus on inequalities within the centralized network, also drawing on work of Trulof, Björkman, and Anand, who have done very significant work on everyday water infrastructure use and how that shapes inequalities, and structural technical inequalities within the water supply network. And I will draw on work I have done collaboratively with colleagues Alda Vidal and Tivale, who have contributed to these research projects and therefore to the result I'm presenting today. So we will focus in particular on this 78% of the that is supplied by the water utility, looking at this, in particular the 56% that receives water through water kiosks. And this, just as an example, is a kiosk in Lilongwe, where mostly women provide, sell water and buy water. And that of course creates a number of social experiences of accessing water, but also social relations that we don't have in contexts where we have in-house connections, very much like you see those who are in Manchester of you or in other cities in the global north. Now, first of all, just to mention the importance of political design behind of cities, I wanted to briefly mention that Lilongwe has been designed, is by design, a dual city with a dualistic water supply system. The city became the capital, was the capital of post-colonial Malawi, and was chosen as a new capital to, of course, wipe away the colonial prints of the previous capital, with the idea of making a city that can be a national symbol and an image of Malawi, a place, as this plan indicates in a document of 1984, that is aesthetically pleasing and where you can work, live and play. And much of it was also developing modern services, centralized infrastructures, gardens and fountains. But from the beginning, it was clear that this type of services had costs and technical challenges, they say in the reports, but also costs that the city wasn't able to meet. And so starting from its very development, it develops through a dual system. I won't go deeper in this and how the two cities develop differently over time, but just to highlight that this city has actually, is by design a city that has very heterogeneous infrastructures. And it's not only about, it's not only about the infrastructural configuration, but it's also about where the water is distributed within these infrastructures. What we see in Lilongwe is a number of infrastructural development to increase water supplies over time, and that involves both the constructions of dams, the constructions of treatment facilities, and development of reservoirs in the city where the water is then distributed to different neighborhoods. And what you can see from this picture, from paper authored, first authored by Tivale, is that between 1966 and 2015, as the infrastructure increases and the water resources for the city increase, there is a strong emphasis, you can see these dots, on expanding infrastructures in the central and the northern zone of the city, where you see the larger dots. These are the areas where there is more higher income residential areas, commercial areas, the airport, and other industrial activities. While the southern zones, where you have the largest growth of informal settlements and lower income settlements, there is a smaller increment in reservoirs. So what you can see very clearly is that there is an uneven distribution of water by design of the reservoirs in the city of Lilongwe, which persisted from the beginning, from the first reservoirs as to more recent development in the city. And I think there is a very clear narrative here that is not hidden or very openly discussed by interviewees as we were doing our work in Lilongwe. The idea that there are zones where you have government offices, where you have important people, and for those people it is important to ensure water 24 hours. We need to ensure that all our pipes and service reservoirs are full with water at all time, while low-income areas, they suggest, have alternatives, which are, as we know, not necessarily always very safe. So there is a very clear idea in Lilongwe that there is a prime customer that needs to be provided with reliable services, and other customers that are more resilient to water shortages, have alternatives, and are a second-ranked customer. And resulting from this continuous development that prioritizes certain areas over others, what we see is that from these three diagrams is that in three periods of snapshots, we find that in the central zone, the city has always more water availability than needed, while in the southern zone, where we have more informal and low-income areas, the demand always exceeds the water availability, as we have seen it through the reservoirs. And so what we see through this infrastructure is that by really mapping their positioning and their size and their technical specification, we can in a way reveal some of the power relations that are very present and very vivid in the city for the past 50 years. But drawing again on everyday urbanism and on the idea that we also have to understand infrastructure as flexible, we also tried to understand what happens with infrastructure in use. So drawing on also practice theory and everyday urbanism, we ask ourselves, do the everyday use of infrastructures reproduce these inequalities, or does it actually address these inequalities? And the main question, therefore, is what type of practices do social infrastructures, but also physical infrastructures in Lilongwe enable and disable? And what we see here in this diagram, you have here the central and northern zone, and here the southern zone. And this pipe, which you see, I hope you can see, basically is an emergency pipe that should transfer water from the south to the north and vice versa in cases of emergencies. Well, what happens in the everyday use of this pipe, and also based on this idea of the prime customers, is that we see an institutionalization of the use of the transfer of water from the south to the central and northern zone, where there is already more water. And the idea behind is always the same, that decisions on where water is distributed are made by field officers who actually operate the system, opening and closing the valves, is based on where the critical customers are. And as the engineer says explicitly, unluckily for users in the southern zone, these critical users are not located there. But I also wanted to highlight that we see also other practices in this everyday use. If generally the most critical, those who are defined the critical users are prioritized, we also find that there are other social ties that at times sporadically, episodically change the distribution in favor of lower income households. That, for example, happens when a colleague or a relative stays in an area that they know has had no water for several days. The field engineers may decide to switch, close the valves in a way that lower income neighborhoods receive some more water. So this is just to highlight that infrastructure in use can either reinforce or reproduce or reduce the inequalities, structural inequalities produced by the infrastructure. And with that, I move to the second point, which has to do with how the force of infrastructure in shaping social order. Here, a very simple diagram to suggest that when we have, as in the diagram at the bottom, household in-house connections, there is really not much relational dynamics occurring between in the process of drinking water and paying for the water. We receive water at home and we pay the water bill, and there is no interaction. At the kiosk, the situation is very different because, as I was showing in the beginning, mostly women will sell water at the kiosks, and people have to go to the kiosk to buy it. So there is a number of social relations that are developed in the kiosks, and some of these have actually created problem in revenue collection for the water utility. Because as the Lilongwe Water Board explains, there was a lot of political interference, and politicians used to go there and play their games. And what he refers to is politicians going to kiosk attendants to ask them for the money they had collected from customers. So kiosk attendants were often unable to then return the revenue to the water utility. And the water utility was even thinking of disconnecting kiosks because they had collected a large number of arrears. So in response to this, we have WaterAid intervened and proposed the development of community-based water users associations, which now collect the revenue from the kiosk attendants and give it to water utility. But why does this work better than it worked without the water users association? It is also very much because the people who were before asking money from the kiosk attendants are now part of these water users associations. As the same interviewee explains, now they are no longer playing their games in the low-income areas. We have them in the board, we have them in the executive committees. So what we see here is that what before was defined by the water board as corruption is now institutionalized in the water users associations. And the big change here is that whilst before the water utility was bearing the costs because revenue wasn't collected, now the costs of these organizations where everybody has a salary or honoraria for the board of trustees and executive committee are passed on to the consumers in the form of higher tariffs. And so on the one hand, you see that this water users association changed the social order because they do reinforce certain power dynamics that are already present in the communities. And on the other hand, they also change gendered relations of an infrastructural labor of water. What we see is that there are more than 800 women now having a job, which is a quite stable job in informal settlements, which, as you also from presentation from Mtafu, you can understand you've heard is not particularly common. And so on the one hand, there is an opportunity. On the other hand, there is also a reproduction of certain gendered inequalities, because what we see is that women are mostly present as kiosk attendants and are much less present and often excluded from the decision-making organs of the water users associations. So you have a contribution, a participation in terms of becoming water vendors and having an income, but in the hierarchies of the organizations, you find again this gender participation, distinction in participation in decision-making of these organizations. And because these water kiosks often suffer from water shortages, the kiosk attendants, like this kiosk attendant who also participated in a documentary we did, explains that often water is only available at night, and so she has to leave her child at home alone to go open the water and sell the water for the women who also have to go during the night to collect water. But because these challenges are experienced by women kiosk attendants, they're often not reported very strongly by the management, who is less affected by these challenges, and it's mainly, it's very much male dominated. Another important element is of infrastructure is its ability to protect from water contamination. And even if we are talking about one water supply network, what we see in Lilongwe is that the type of infrastructure that are used at the different stages, the reservoirs, the pipes, in different parts of the cities are very different. So while in the central city you have better quality infrastructure, in lower income neighborhoods, the infrastructure is not as good and is also very much exposed to breakage and illegal connection. And that has an impact on the quality of the water that then residents will find at the pipe. And in the picture on the top here, you see Akusua. She was also involved in the project, and she has done extensive water quality campaign to understand if the water within this network, which is one network and provides the same water, which has received the same treatment, actually provides the same water quality to different users. And what she found is that the water in-house taps is of a higher and safer quality than the water that is consumed at the water kiosks, as you can see from this diagram, from this figure. Here, in some kiosks, the water is still within the World Health Organization standards of E. coli, and in some it is already above. But what we need to consider, something that Trulov also brought up in the previous seminar, is that the water in these settlements is not consumed directly. Women actually become an infrastructure alongside their buckets and other infrastructure to carry water. So the water is then carried home where it is stored, and in the storage, water is often further contaminated. And what we see when we compare the water really where it's been consumed is that the quality has dropped significantly and becomes, in some cases, dangerous for consumption. So we have the same network, we have different infrastructures, different pipes, different reservoirs, and then ultimately different water quality across the neighborhoods served by the water utility. Despite this evidence, which we have gathered over the past years, the fact that there is a centralized infrastructure network creates the idea that the water is safe. So for the water utility, water from the Lilongwe Water Board is treated, and therefore it is of good water quality. So treatment equals quality. As far as they are aware, they suggest that the water from the kiosks is of the same quality of the water supplied to other households in higher income neighborhoods. But not only this doesn't necessarily reflect the reality, but it also shifts the responsibility of disease in some cases on users. If they are getting some disease from the water, it's because they have it's their responsibility. It has nothing to do with the infrastructure of the city and the quality of water that is provided to the users. And moving a bit beyond the case of Lilongwe, for example, in Mozambique, they call the cholera diseases the disease of dirty hands, and that very clearly shifts the responsibility of the contamination, of being healthy, being sanitary on the users, without acknowledging all the infrastructural everyday practices and challenges, coping strategies that low-income residents have to implement to actually have water at home. This is my last point, and it is about the unintended effects of infrastructures, unintended consequences of infrastructures. The fact that they are unintended doesn't mean necessarily that the different actors will care, but I think we can say that, for example, elite capture, which we have seen in the analysis of the social order, is an unintended consequence. Water contamination is also an unintended consequence. There is no intention in creating an infrastructure that will have differentiated water security for different users, but it is indeed what the infrastructure will do based on the technical specification. I think employment of a kiosk attendant is also a positive unintended consequence. There is no purpose attempt to create employment, but indeed that type of infrastructural configurations does create employment. But there is also a last unintended consequence on which I want to close, because it's very frequent in many cities in the global south, is that people in low-income areas have a much lower quality of the service, but pay a much higher price. And this is also an unintended consequence that is not addressed, though, by the government nor by the water utility. So what you see in this last diagram is the price, the dotted line is the bulk tariff that the water utility, at which the water utility sells water to the Water Users Association. As you can see, it has grown very little over the past, between 2013 and 2018. What you see next is the price for in-house connection. So what the water utility charges people that have in-house connection. And what you see, it has increased from 100 to 200 to 300 plus. And then above you see the price that the Water Users Association charge low-income dwellers in low-income areas. And you can see how sharp the increase up to 1,000 metikais, Malawi kwacha, sorry, per liter. So you see there is a stark difference between what high income and low income dwellers pay for water. And we see that with these arrangements that have been developed over time, the costs of this relatively dysfunctional infrastructures have been passed on to consumers. And this was my last point, and thank you very much for your attention. Here you have a link to a documentary I have done with Charles Nkula on this topic that some of you might be interested in watching. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maria Rusca. This is a very interesting presentation. We have a few questions for you. The first is from Professor Norma Valencio. She's saying that excellent presentation. In Brazil, one of the most challenging situations in the present days related to the reservoirs or dams are the risks of collapse due to lack of maintenance and technical errors in the projects and so on, causing a great flooding events with considerable socio-environmental losses and damages in the communities nearby. Do you consider that it could become a problem in the region that you are focusing on?
Yeah, that's really a very good point, because there, as you've seen, there are very different technical specifications as when we look at reservoirs. And indeed, also in Lilongwe, there has been a collapse of a reservoir. And basically what this emphasizes is that one inequality also can accumulate and produce other inequalities. So one inequality in the lower sized reservoirs, lower capacity, risk of collapse, then creates another inequality by increasing flood risks. So I think it's very, I haven't looked at it personally, but it is indeed in many cases, also in Lilongwe, you can see how one inequality produces another one and then another one. For low-income dwellers. So definitely something to explore further also in Lilongwe.
Thank you very much. The next one is from Beacon Mbiba. Regarding the photographs of women at the kiosk, how did you secure the consent of each of them to take the photo? This is a research ethics question.
That photo is a screenshot from a documentary that I was filming. So when I was filming the documentary, I was walking around the city with a member of the Water Users Association and a journalist. So we would inform the people that we would be filming in a location for 10 minutes before they reach the kiosks. And those who didn't want to be filmed stayed to the side for the 5 minutes of filming, and the rest was decided to be in. But of course, yes, so it was an informed consent, but oral consent. And many of the people you see at the kiosks, once the documentary was finalized, we went to screen it and were invited to the screening with politicians and NGOs, etc.
The last question before we go to our next presentation. Have you thought about developing an alternative water distribution network instead of the traditional pipe water supply that also requires huge amounts of chemicals for purification, besides invisible, soluble, heavy metal contamination?
So I think the advantage of working with colleagues who can also really point at the network, at the infrastructure, is that you actually can think of redesigning the network in a way, and that's thanks to my colleagues, engineering colleagues, that is actually more equitable. So that I've been thinking about. I have that map, and I think, right, this is how we could design the same network more equitably. But thinking of other types of networks and other types of technologies, I haven't myself thought about it, but I am reaching the understanding that the decentralized networks will never be able to actually perform, and that we need to think of alternatives. But I am a social scientist, so I would need the strong collaboration of other colleagues to be able to redesign these infrastructures.
Thank you very much. A quick reminder to colleagues, attendees on the platform. We have some of our panelists attending to some questions that were not read out here. So you can just quickly have a look at the chat box. You may have your question answered. We have our final presentation from Dr. Chiko Makore from the University of Salford. She's presenting on age-friendly infrastructure in Africa's cities, enabling health and well-being for older people in urban Zimbabwe. Doctor, you can take over.
Great, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's so great to be a part of this discussion and the wider series on infrastructure for fragmented cities. So as Dr. Salia said, my name is Busisiwe Chiko Makore, and today the title of my presentation is Age-Friendly Infrastructure in Africa Cities as a question, and enabling health and well-being for older people in Zimbabwe. So I will talk for about 20 minutes or so on the global discourse on older people in the urban space, specific to Africa's urban areas, and then lead to illustration of part of a research study, which was done a few years ago between 2014 and 2018, and some of the findings and insights from that study specific to sort of home infrastructure. So why aging? Why now? Why in the urban areas? Why are we talking about it in Africa? Well, aging itself is indeed a global phenomenon that's been receiving increasing attention from multiple sectors. Globally in 2020, we've got 2/3 of older people living in middle income countries, and that continues to increase proportionally. By 2050, predicted about 1 in 5. So all over the world, there is predicted an increase and continues to be in the number of people, older people, over the age of 60, including Africa. And though this continent, our continent, remains relatively young compared to other parts of the world, the number of older persons is expected to grow fastest in Africa over the coming decades. So with the population age 60 and over predicted to increase more than threefold between 2017 and 2050. So this demographic change has sort of fueled this global discourse that has been growing and growing and growing. And part of that has been about the development of age-friendly cities, communities, age-friendly infrastructure, largely by international organizations such as the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and I sort of created this term of age-friendly environments, age-friendly infrastructure. And what that means really is about fostering healthy and active aging by building and maintaining, as you can see from this image to the right, intrinsic capacity, our understanding and our capacity across the life course, across our development as we age, and enabling people to have greater ability, functional ability. And in practical terms, this really just means age-friendly environments are free from the physical, the social barriers, and are supported by systems and infrastructure and policies and services, technologies that promote health and build and maintain physical and mental capacity across the life course, as well as enabling people and older people, even when experiencing capacity loss, to continue to do the things that they value. So the World Health Organization in 2010 sort of really started this momentum on age-friendly cities and looking at the physical and the social infrastructure within cities from an age-friendly lens, and established this 2010 global network that has continued to grow in momentum, in membership, which reflects cities' commitment to listen to the needs of the aging population, according to their words, to assess and monitor the age friendliness and work collaboratively with older people and across sectors to create age-friendly physical and social environments. And as you can see from this image, this is the most recent membership of this network, and kind of just shows the commitment that's being made in cities across the world. And as you can see, the sort of absence of commitment from cities and communities within Africa based on this network. Although this on its own is obviously not an accurate reflection to the commitment to age friendliness in Africa, I think many would say that it's embedded in a lot of the systems that we do, but the Sustainable Development Goals have acted as a catalyst for sustainable and inclusive urban development, as well as other global agendas, such as the New Urban Agenda 2030 and the African Agenda 2063. So these agendas have significant implications for healthy aging. And this year is actually the first year of the Decade of Healthy Aging, the United Nations Decade of Healthy Aging, which is to last 10 years, initiated as this sort of global collaboration to improve the lives of older people, their families, and their communities. So you see an alignment, I think, of much of the sort of global discourses and goals that have significant implication for the lives of older people within them. And towns and cities in Africa are said to face the sort of complex developmental issue of simultaneous poverty and unprecedented aging without the necessary health and socioeconomic infrastructures or age provision to support their older populations. So while policy interventions may vary across Africa, studies have shown that they consistently demonstrated how poverty experienced in adulthood is likely to deepen with age, especially where there is a lack of adequate infrastructure, policies, guidelines, etc., to address the interests and needs of older people. And my focus then over the next few minutes is specifically in Zimbabwe. Here, as you can see, an image of sort of its geographical location, and specifically in the capital city in Harare. And I will be more specific within a case study and an element of that. In Zimbabwe's urban environment, the physical environment in which the dwellings are located and where they lead is largely known to be sort of increasingly inadequate for the needs of older people. And aging in Zimbabwe is unfolding in context of acute social ills, resource constraints, widespread economic strain, and the increasing level of urbanization caused by complex rural to urban migration flows of the years has brought incredible challenges, I think, to the major cities in Zimbabwe, though placing a strain on basic services, including safe and affordable water and sanitation, drainage system, electricity, solid waste management, etc. And the urban policy discourse in Zimbabwe suggests these sort of plural representations of older people. So on one hand, we have older people that are perceived as vulnerable, deficient, in need. And on the other hand, older people can be understood and are represented as embedded in the family, as contributors, as caregivers, as worthy of rights and active participators. And this evidences a continual fluctuation and uncertainty between the different representations and framing of older people. And consequently, this ambivalence reflects an absence of clear recognition of older persons. This also bears in mind that there is this consensus of the positioning of older people within the safety net of the family and the community. And this element of unu and ubuntu, which is this sort of reciprocal community and village-like philosophy, and is something that that is evident in policy, something that even is evident in the social security of that older people are being looked after. They are actually positioned within the family, but this also reinforces the discourses of ambivalence by contrastingly framing older people as vulnerable and invisible, but it also suggests that the family unit provides the supportive and visible environment for them. So it's also a counter perspective to the global scholarly arguments that frame older people as active urban citizens. And additionally, there is this feminization of aging, with older female persons often worst affected. Previous ideologies that were built on the valorization of return to the land, that all people just retire to rural areas as they age, have equally contributed to these 2 decades of marginalization or invisibility of the social group. On the contrary, increasing research on aging within Africa, but also in Zimbabwe, has shown that older people do actually live in urban environments and play a significant role within these communities, urban communities and urban spaces, but also even in informality, where basic services are barely adequate to lead a normal life. The other side of the argument is whether aging population within Zimbabwe has this right to infrastructure such as healthcare at critical health junctures, or due to loss in functional ability and increasing of age. And the right to healthcare and financial assistance is articulated within the new constitution in 2013, and also reflected in the Older Persons Act in 2012 that was produced a year before the Constitution. However, there is this inconsistency in how older people, at what point do they then start to assert these rights, and the definition of older people. The Constitution describes them chronologically as a person who is above the age of 70, and you see the older persons at age 65, and that differs a bit from various other organizations and also internationally. So the use of these different definitions, how we understand and perceive older people within the policy discourse, I think presents these challenges related to asserting the rights of older persons guaranteed in the legislative framework. And you see also here, what I just put is a few bits that from the National Healthy Aging Strategic Plan, which is due to be revised soon, just showing, I guess, the state of infrastructure currently for older people, which shows some of the difficulties, and particularly in accessing healthcare and critical infrastructure. So as a part of a research study from 2014, 2018, and multiple field visits, I will just give you a brief insight into sort of 2 informal settlements that are identified in Harare. The first one is Gun Hill, which you can see to the north east of that map of Harare, and the second one is Zirasekwa Extension, which is, I guess, to the periphery in the west. Informal settlers in Zimbabwe have experienced continued and persistent evictions and fear and misery, and examples such as Operation Muramba China, clean up the rubbish in 2005, and continued from then, including very recent demolitions of informal properties during our current pandemic, which demonstrate a prevailing governmental attitude that has led to this sort of disquieted aggression to informality, and a refusal to provide or recognize informal settlers, and the continued politicization of that. And there is some recognition of informality, which has come through slum upgrading programs and key organizations such as the Slum Dwellers Organization and Homeless Federation within the city of Harare. And this marks quite a key sort of progressive relationship between local authority, Harare City Council, and then also the community. However, even within these case studies that I'll show, they don't necessarily represent the totality of older persons living within informality, but hopefully can sort of illustrate some aspects of the urban spaces. So here, what you see is the Gun Hill settlement, which is controversially situated in the northeast of Harare city center. And it is within the leafy and low density residential suburban area. So we can see Bordeaux Racecourse is just to the west of that. And it is one of the few informal settlements with approximately 52 and possibly changing households that is located quite close to Harare city center. The households include intergenerational families, as well as a number of immigrants from Malawi and Mozambique. And the settlement itself started in 1973 as a coping strategy by the urban homeless, who could neither be accommodated by the prevailing colonial residential laws and existing housing stock, but became home for people who could not afford those high rents. And then also became a key sort of place for those who were being evicted during these sort of mass evictions and demolitions of properties around the city. So older people form a part of the Dunhill community from as early as 1981. The majority of the population of families of men who work or worked as horse grooms at the neighboring Bordeaux Racecourse, which you can see to the top right there, in the colonial area and into sort of independence. The settlement consists almost entirely of self-constructed housing built in private land, and the land the settlers are occupying is reserved for commercial housing and the development of a freeway from the roundabout into sort of the main road here. So because of that, there's been this sort of long-standing battle and politicization of this area and this settlement. And that has acted as a catalyst for numerous evictions experienced by the residents over the last few decades, as well as increasing sort of land negotiations with the city council and the Zimbabwe Homeless Federation and the Slum Dealers Association in allocating and sort of moving the residents to a location which was found at the periphery of Harare. So you can see at the bottom image that shows the settlement there. Zimbabwe extension is located at the western periphery of the city, approximately about 18 kilometers west of Harare, and was established by the government in 1993. Originally, over 2,000 families resided in Zimbabwe extension, and then the government relocated some of these families to sort of formalized neighborhoods, but then mass evictions as well, and continued mass evictions and demolitions also sent approximately 150 families and continued to settle within Zimbabwe. And according to the Homeless Federation, a couple of years ago, that almost 450 families lived there. Zimbabwe extension was developed to be an extension to the main high density community, which you can see to the bottom right, and established in the late 1950s as a residential area in the colonial area for the Black Zimbabweans working as domestic workers employed in the nearby and formerly white areas. So in contrast to Gun Hill, actually, this main area, Zimbabwe extension, has community services such as a clinic and a government-administered primary school, a privately run secondary school. There's also a variety of formal shops and informal tuck shops connected to the home. So in the community and other services, there's also a fuel station, and itself, though, as a settlement, it sits on the margins of the main community, Zimbabwe, and so it lacks this infrastructural connection to the central area, although that was intended, and there was sort of a wetlands between them. So I'll touch on one aspect of the case studies, which is home infrastructure and environment with sort of an age lens. The home itself is a central part of the life of older men and women in this study. Processes of making one's home reflects older persons' sort of active role in the construction of space that places a crucial role in maintaining their health and well-being. So such processes were evident in the narratives from the study about their daily activities and responsibilities, as well as sort of creating spaces of care for their grandchildren. Much of that actually influenced, for a lot of the older people, influenced the move sort of from rural areas to urban because of caring responsibilities and sort of the increase of the migration of young professionals outside of the country. And so we see older people are very much involved in these daily practices of sort of cooking and cleaning, and have that responsibility of the home within the households. They're significantly challenged with accessing safe drinking water. There is a community borehole that was set up, and you see that to the bottom, that was set up by the owners of the racecourse as sort of a private donation as well, because of a lot of the workers live within this settlement. But in general, it's particularly problematic for older people who experience a range of difficulties, such as poor or inability in handling and using their upper and lower extremities, and limitations of stamina and strength. So these difficulties require older people to work much harder than other age groups to complete these daily activities, and also sort of live independently and safely. The setup of cooking facilities on the ground requires older people to constantly, and often older women, constantly bending and cooking and really squatting in uncomfortable positions. Any older persons with the prevalence of poor coordination, which we found over 80% of the older people had some form of a long-term health condition that impacted coordination and mobility. So the tasks of outdoor cooking or accessing water, etc., became much more difficult. We also experienced older people who experienced that complete degradation or poor or degradation of sight. So within Gun Hill, the local authorities have been reluctant to extend basic services to informal settlements, and therefore looking to sort of relocate them, although this settlement in itself has lasted since that 1973. So due to the challenging socioeconomic climate and the increasing poverty, residents were given access to these temporary housing and wooden cabins as part of temporary upgrading programs to increase, but because of lack of funds, they haven't been able to find that to be able to upgrade to these cabins. And so we find that older people are largely actually living in makeshift dwelling, and maybe those in much bigger households and embedded within bigger households are living in cabins. And Zero Sekwe extension has a lot more progress than Gun Hill because of how it started. It was very much endorsed by the government, and there was initial commitment by organizations such as Slum Dwellers International, local community-based organizations to see Zero Sekwe extension as this sort of example of how we can start to formalize our spaces, how we can start to upgrade the settlements and increase formalization within them. So there is a lot more infrastructure here, and that continues to develop key elements of co-production and being able to integrate the community within the upgrading processes were seen and continue to be seen, and older people were actually quite at the center of those co-productive practices, such as helping to build the communal borehole and upgrading the wooden cabins to brick homes, and helping as well with the community center and the nursery. The nursery and the center is completely run by older women, and they play a large part in sort of working as vendors and in some of the local stores. So there is some progress as well in terms of the infrastructure. There's an introduction of the EcoSan toilet, which you see to the bottom right, bottom left, sorry, an eco-san toilet is the sanitation system that doesn't require any water to function. So not only does it save on water, but it's entirely isolated from the environment, so it doesn't contaminate underground water resources. The introduction of these toilets was seen as a major upgrade. They were praised completely by older people. However, just the evidence of them, the availability of them was great, but the design of the toilet itself was actually quite inaccessible. On further exploration with older people as to how they access and they sort of manage through it, but mobility is a really big issue. The step access that was built because of the toilets, the waste containers have to be stored above ground. So this is a typical example of interventions that are intended to better the lives of informal settlers, but without consideration of the diversities and diverse capacities and abilities of the settlers. And although when asked, older people feel like they are included in these decision-making, what we find is they struggle to articulate within sort of consultation processes, articulate some of these key issues when it comes to proposals and interventions. And for older people who experience the difficulties in accessing and wanted then to have, for example, ramp access, they go through an incredibly laborious process of applying for funding for ramp access. And therefore, the unavailability of services is extremely detrimental to the lives of older people, limiting their ability to complete these daily responsibilities. And older women tasked with caring for the home experience and that associated fear of actually not meeting the needs of the home and fulfilling their duty. So in conclusion, addressing the health and well-being of older people is a significant issue when considering their quality of older life, and casting all older people as able to be fully embedded in the family unit as part of discourses of UNU or Ubuntu and older people being a part of this community can be equally damaging in the context of urban Zimbabwe. And it may lead to policymakers ignoring older people who are vulnerable and hard to reach. And there is this desire then for housing that enables them to be safe and comfortable regardless of their age, income, or level of capacity. And however, this can be challenging in settings of informality, limited basic infrastructure. And when older people experience a significant loss of capacity, previously minor household barriers become major obstacles to managing their daily needs. And a commitment to the achievement of sustainable development goals means a commitment to taking determined actions to develop inclusive evidence-based policies and practices across all sectors that strengthen the abilities of older people to maintain autonomy, health, and well-being. And indeed, further data and evidence, disaggregated data and evidence is needed within the urban environment. But a recognition that older people have long-lasting needs for a health and social infrastructure that is integrated and person-centered, not based on age or disease. And this type of action needs to recognize also older people within informal spaces, supporting older people who are poor, isolated, lonely to access food services and infrastructures. And a change of narrative then must take place to transition towards more sustainable conditions for older people. And to do this requires the collaboration of multiple sectors: health, long-term care, transport, beyond health and long-term care, but including transport, housing, infrastructure, technology, information, communication, etc., as an integral part of the overall journey to sustainability, health, and well-being. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chiko. We have just one question for your beautiful presentation and then nice pictures that you have shown us. This is from Dr. Sorry, I have to. Okay, this is from Beacon Mdida. how do you measure agent friendliness of a city or a neighborhood? And in your case studies, how would outcomes of using the measure compare when applied across social groups, for example, older people, children, expecting mothers, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question. Previously I'd mentioned about the World Health Organization age-friendly movement, and part of that network is the developing of a sort of a framework to measure age friendliness, to understand it, and to develop some core indicators for assessing and monitoring the age friendliness of cities, which is very contextual at the moment. And they, although this was started in 2014, that continues to be developed at a global level, but it has become very much a local frameworks that have been developed. I think your comment about actually comparison across different age groups or social groups is something that needs to definitely be integrated within the indicators for assessing age friendliness. There is no framework at the moment that exists within Zimbabwe, and from what I am aware of, there is no framework for measuring age friendliness within sub-Saharan Africa. Although there is a lot of discourse about it, but there isn't yet a recognized framework.
All right, thank you very much. We have another question from Dr. Maria Rusca, but we are pressed for time. So if you can kindly send her answers through the chat box. We have the final session, and I would like to hand over to Professor Gasparatos to take us through. Thank you.
I think it is fine to answer these questions. I just will have one question for every participant. So maybe it is fine to answer these questions from Dr. Rusca.
All right, okay. So what she says, thanks for a very interesting presentation. I have a few small questions. The first is a simple curiosity. This seems to be a very understudied topic. Is it so? How much do we know? The second, if possible, you mentioned different and shifting perceptions of older people. I was wondering how this shapes perceptions of older people themselves.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, it is an understudied topic within this geographical area, within sub-Saharan Africa, absolutely. I mentioned, and it's without trying to generalize, part of that is this assumption that older people are very much embedded in family units, and therefore when we talk about the family and when we talk about the community, we inadvertently talk about older people, that they are being cared for, they are being taken care of, you know, and also it is the fact that we are a demographically young population, and therefore the needs of children, the needs of the youth drive these priorities and interventions, and therefore probably mask some of the key issues for older people. And it goes back to even what Dr. Mbibo was saying about his question about older people in comparison to children and expecting mothers, but it's also understanding the sort of the contribution of older people within these different social groups and the links and the connections between there. So for example, older people in our study were very much had very key caring roles, but were also very economically active. They were working, they were going to city center as vendors and sellers, but also were supporting other sort of young populations and the youth in terms of their activities as well. So there are different elements as to how they are linked, and I think there needs to be more understanding. I think contextual understanding as to those interconnections with other social groups, and therefore developing a framework to start to understand how to measure that. and the perceptions of older people themselves, the shifting perceptions of older people and older people themselves. I mean, this is not something that I particularly studied, but anecdotally that came out through the study was this perception of actually being valued within their household, but then not within sort of the larger community or city. And again, I think this invisibility within the policy and within some of that sort of strategic level comes across a bit within the sort of the personal perception that actually the government doesn't recognize us, the government doesn't see us, doesn't understand us. But then within the household and within the community, there seems to be this level of confidence that actually I am respected, I am seen as someone who's older, and people come and ask me questions, etc. But when I go out of my household, when I go out of my community, then I feel invisible, and then I don't feel seen. So I think it's the different scales, I think, to that perception and understanding that is also quite critical in how we can start to respond to that sort of shifting understanding and representation of older people.
Thank you very much. So here comes our next session so we have our discussant, Professor Gasparatos, if you can kindly take over.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank all the presenters for really excellent presentations. There was a very good cross-section of different aspects of infrastructure in different countries through different perspectives. A very common thread that I saw, it was very visible in most of them, was the issue of informality and, of course, issues related to inequalities. But a little bit lower key aspect that was coming from each presentation, and I would like to ask a couple of questions, all the panel members together, was the following. It was not always, from my understanding by single presentations, it has not always been infrastructure constraints. There are wider social or policy issues that are prohibiting the possibility of infrastructure either to be developed or to meet the needs of people. For example, Dr. Ahmed mentioned issues of land tenure, that without land tenure rights, it's almost impossible to get access to electricity. Dr. Manda mentioned disjointed rules and selective and possibly corrupt implementation. Dr. Rusca mentioned issues related to gender inequalities and pervasive power inequalities that again were very visible in the way that people were getting access to infrastructure and was permeating by the type of infrastructure they were getting access to. And Dr. Nkumbe mentioned the fact that there is a lack of age-friendly safety nets generally in the policies that might be permeating down in the type of infrastructure that is reaching actually the people. So my question is, it's basically two questions. Do these, beyond infrastructure issues, offer an insurmountable obstacle to provide inclusive access to infrastructure, or can they be circumnavigated? And a second question that can be a little bit more provocative, can infrastructure be used as a way to partly tackle these wider social issues? Very big questions, I think, all of them, both of them. It's 12:30 here, so I hope I make sense in the things that I'm asking. But maybe, I do not know, maybe to give the opportunity to panelists to reflect on them or aspects of it, maybe. So whoever wants to start.
I can start if that works for the rest. Yes, thank you for the great questions. They're not easy questions to answer quickly. So I think I'll answer one because they're really important questions. I think as you mentioned, there is my focus very much also is on the power asymmetries that also generate uneven production of condition of access across urban spaces in Lilongwe and elsewhere. And so there is a lot of discussion now. Can this power relations be modified, and how can we actually generate change? And I think from my perspective, from this work, I have two hopes. One is, of course, very much also invoked by critical scholars, is the idea of incremental change. If we cannot count so much on changes coming from our policies, from our governments, there is much attention, and also through studies on the everyday, on the idea, can we change, can we transform these inequalities through our everyday practices? For example, in other studies in Sudan, in Khartoum, we find practices of water gifting in neighborhoods where you have higher income and lower income residents. So practices of solidarities that overturn or change dynamics that are more related to market-based relations. And that's one thing. So solidarity, or practices through which community organizations contribute to produce different networks. And it goes back to informality. In Mozambique, in Malawi, in Mozambique, in Maputo, there are small-scale providers, for example, that are providing access to services where the water utility doesn't reach. And in many cases, they actually provide a better service than the water utility. So these incremental changes beyond the state presence, beyond state commitment to ensure inclusive services are one response. And I think the other is, is education, and that's maybe why some of us also are in education and research, because I think, for example, I think of engineers in Lilongwe. They are trained to think that the network has to look in a certain way, and that certain customers are more important than others. And not to think necessarily through the city with large pockets of informality and low-income residents. And I think this is maybe more education for engineers or for interdisciplinary scholarship, an education that is more attuned with the realities of cities in the global south, and with the infrastructures that are there, and that can also develop a different ethics of what access to services should be and for whom they should be. I think that's very important.
Thank you very much. Would somebody else would like to take the next turn?
Yeah, can I? Okay. Yes, I your comments are really interesting. And then the issue about whether infrastructure can actually tackle some of the social inequalities, how can that be? To me, what I see is that for infrastructure to actually be a kind of a pathway to addressing inequalities, especially in cities, the most important thing is to address the systemic barriers that are tied to land tenure related issues in cities, especially in the context where I do my research. A lot of urban infrastructure services are linked directly to secure land tenure. For example, if you want to get pipe-borne water from the government, connected to your dwelling, you need to prove your tenancy rights. If you need electricity, similar. So the critical issue that is actually shaping or even causing or perpetuating the inequalities are often related to systematic barriers on land rights. And then by addressing those kind of systematic issues, which is more of a policy and a political aspect within cities, then it becomes very easy that infrastructures can be a panacea and actually shaping some of the inequalities. But until that aspect of urban land tenure issues are addressed, then it's still like going around, and then a lot of the other alternatives that urban dwellers themselves are using to cope end up actually perpetuating the inequalities again. For example, there are a lot of environmental risks that are associated with the social practices. The fact that I cannot have secure land tenure and I cannot get electricity from government, then I decide to opt for an illegal connection using substandard cables, then it opens up that kind of environmental risk and open up the entire neighborhood to the risk of urban fires. So what that it means is that the social practices in themselves that urban dwellers are using and others to address their urban infrastructure needs come with a lot of environmental risks. So, but to cut or to curtail what have drove them to use or to go for some of these, the major thing is often tied to their tenure rights, and for them not having their tenure rights in order to be linked to the state infrastructure provisions. So I think by having that kind of policy directives where urban dwellers or the city government can start thinking of how to do land adjustment related kind of thing and give every urban dweller, especially in the informal settlement, a sort of legal, will I say, tenure to that access of land where they are either squatting or so that can easily facilitate their access to state-led provision of infrastructure. Until that is done, then the vicious cycle of perpetuating inequalities through infrastructure will persist.
Can I come in?
Yes, please. Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed.
Yeah, I do agree with Dr. Rusca and Ahmed on sort of the complexities and so the issue of land tenure as well, and the community-based practices that Dr. Rusca was mentioning. I think it's also about understanding the people and the residents themselves. I think there is, of course, this policy level, this political level, and how that then resonates at a household level, the personal, individual level. And for example, the site that I conducted my study, the state were able to find a geographical area to the periphery of the city to relocate the residents, but they've had real difficulty relocating them. And at this specific site, there are communal taps which the current site doesn't have. So there's a sort of a type of an improvement in infrastructure there, and they will get access to that. But it's the complexities arise in the political element, but also in sort of the motives of the people, that the way that they live, you know, that actually being closer to the city center and being closer to the economic advantage of that is more important to them than actually being placed in this area where they might get a land tenure. They will get a land tenure actually, but and improved infrastructure, but that to them is less important when compared to the economic advantage that they have as to where exactly this informal settlement is in relation to the periphery area that they're being relocated to. So I guess it's understanding, I think, some of those complexities of how residents live, how citizens access infrastructure, the motives behind that, and the reasons for doing that, and then also understanding those levels of inequalities.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nkumbe. I cannot see online Dr. Manda. Maybe his connection is not that great. So from my side, I would like to thank once more all the speakers for their excellent presentations, very thought-provoking. And I would like to pass it to the organizers about some final words. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Gasparatos, for your discussions with the presenters. I would like to announce that our next session will be on infrastructure in the Middle East. Very interesting presentations will be coming on the 18th of July, so do make time for this. I will also want to thank everyone for attending, and then please do visit the Sustainable Infrastructure website for more information and previous recording of our Zoom presentations. And thank you very much to the speakers for your wonderful presentations and the time you have taken to do all this. We have really learned a lot from this. Thank you very much. And then we wish to see you once again in the near future. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.